So we are finishing chapter 6 with Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, and I hope to start chapter 7. The slides were up. I hope to finish chapter 7 on Wednesday and start the language chapter. The slides will be sent to you. And so Vygotsky, so we talked about, just to remind you, we talked about Piaget, we talked about core knowledge theories, domain theories, and this was the third major theory that we were going to cover in early childhood cognitive development. And so this is what we are doing today. So according to Vygotsky, cognition is based on not only the child's quest for constructing knowledge. So Vygotsky does acknowledge that children construct knowledge, just like Piaget, but he also emphasizes social interactions and language as factors that substantially, formatively change the way children think. I want to emphasize this. This is not just a matter of obtaining more information. He believes that the kind of reasoning a child with language has is different than the kind of reasoning a child with no language has. Language actually has a formative impact on children's thinking. And for this reason, rapid language growth leads to change in thinking. Now, he was very much focused on language. Hence, he also looked at how children use language when they are confronted with problems. So if there's a problem to solve, how does a child utilize language? And he noted the occurrence of what he calls private speech. Now, here, private speech is basically child's talking through problems. And we see this a lot in the preschool period. Before language becomes internalized, children, you know how you can actually think, like if you were solving a problem, I saw you guys take midterm, for example, last week. I'm sure all of you guys were thinking, but I wasn't hearing any noise in the class. Nobody was thinking aloud because you have the capacity to think with language in your head, right? But young children don't automatically get this when they learn language. First, their language, the language of thought, is very much aloud. We hear it. And gradually, it becomes a murmur, a whisper, and then it disappears because it becomes internalized. This was called egocentric speech by Piaget because he wanted to highlight how the child was not able to take another's perspective in using language, that it was for his own perspective, for his own benefit. But Vygotsky approaches this from a different perspective. He says this ability, once it is internalized, thinking in language, is going to become one of the major drivers of reasoning and thinking. Yes. It helps guide behavior. For example, even us adults, we find ourselves talking through very difficult problems. When you can't solve something, well, after you've made an error and you're trying to figure out why the error was an error, or when we are confused. Yes, children with learning and behavior problems use private speech longer. So it's a mark of cognitive maturity at the same time. Yes, and as we can see, that moderately difficult problems lead to more private speech. But if it is so difficult that you are speechless, then obviously the outside speech also ceases. The zone of proximal development, how many of you have heard this term before? I expect all of you, actually, only 3 of you. Okay. What is it for? What is zone of proximal development? It is basically an imaginary area. Let's think that the child has a capacity, right? What they can do on their own. And let's say if we provided adequate assistance to this child, scaffolding, then the child can do more, right? And so that area between what the child can do by themselves versus what the child can achieve with adequate assistance is the zone of proximal development. So for Piaget, for Vygotsky, I'm sorry, it wasn't about classifying children into ability groups. He was most interested in learning and what the children could achieve if they were given appropriate scaffolding. What is the Turkish for scaffolding? Do you know? İnşaatın dışındaki iskele scaffolding. So if you think about it, it is a support. It's the support that is provided. Okay? And in this case, social interactions promote cognitive development because within this zone of proximal development, when adults or other peers, older or the same age, actually help the child and the other person establish what is called intersubjectivity. So they achieve a plane of thinking that both contributes to. And so that is called intersubjectivity. And adults or more knowledgeable peers can guide the child's participation. Rather than telling them what the right answer is, they can basically give little clues, little cues to make the child solve the problem, hence get better. What is one wrong thing? We're going to do Vygotsky for a whole week in 350, and I'm going to emphasize it more there, but just for you guys to get a preliminary understanding of it. Usually, scaffolding is interpreted inaccurately. Zone of proximal development is also interpreted inaccurately, as to say that the child is working with an adult. The child can work with an adult, but two children working together, if one is, for example, older than the other, or two children of the same age working together, can actually also provide scaffolding for one another and function within the zone of proximal development. Vygotsky put a premium on make-believe play. We saw that Piaget thought about it. Piaget thought about it because he thought that the kind of make-believe play a child engaged in was a mirror of the child's symbolic development. So for Piaget, it was more a reflection, a mirror. But for Vygotsky, this is a tool through which children learn. So the way he's looking at it is a little bit different than how Piaget conceptualized it. And the kind of emphasis Vygotsky is putting on play is for that reason different than the kind of emphasis Piaget put on play. He called it the leading activity of early childhood. Leading not because this is what children do most, leading not because this is what children do best, leading because children learn most in play. That was Vygotsky's thinking. So he thought that imaginary substitutions, remember imaginary substitutions is imagining one object is standing in for another, imagining roles for people or dolls. Imaginary substitutions help children separate thinking from objects. This is similar to Piaget. But Vygotsky emphasized the rules within play. And when we say play for young children, probably we are thinking very few rules. So if we're imagining this child pretending with the teddy bear that they're having a tea party, we probably are thinking there are no rules here. But that's not true, right? There are rules. There's how do you act in a tea party? For example, this teddy bear cannot all of a sudden ask for a hamburger. That's not what happens in a tea party. They know that there is no liquid in those cups, but they will pretend to drink from it, right? This child will not expect that her hunger is satisfied or her thirst is satisfied because she's pretend drinking. She knows that this is just pretend. So there are rules within every pretend frame. And these rules help the child understand the boundaries between situations and contexts, but also to regulate their behaviors. Okay, so according to him, make-believe play is the major means by which children grow cognitively. I talked about this. Toddlers need encouragement to participate in imaginative make-believe play. It doesn't come easy. So we know that in Western societies, industrialized societies, parents actually spend quite a bit of time pretending with their children, especially when they're little babies. So the first instances of pretend are not really solitary productions for children in these countries, but mothers pretend. They may pretend to be talking on the phone with their little kid. They may pretend to feed the kid with an empty spoon and all of those good things. Thus, the child actually gets a head start in pretending. Is pretend play universal? Yes, it is. So children in tribal societies in the Amazon, places in Africa, children in China, children in Japan, children in Holland, they all pretend. And that's what's very interesting, actually, about pretend play. But how much they pretend is a different. So it changes culture from culture, because some cultures promote it more. In some cultures, parents think that it is good to promote children's pretend play. In others, parents may think children will pretend no matter what I do. Why should I promote it, right? And so according to these different attitudes, how much a child plays may vary from one culture to the next, but whether a child pretend plays or not is universal. Who does not engage in pretend play? Children with autism. Not the high-end spectrum, but especially the low-end spectrum. It seems like then there we have a cluster of abilities. I mean, they have language difficulties, they have communication difficulties, especially spontaneous language. They also have executive function problems, but they also remarkably do not spontaneously engage in fantasy play. They may play with cars, they may play with objects, but they don't assign roles. They don't do object substitutions in the way that other children do. And so it seems like it is a diagnostic criteria for children on the autistic spectrum, pervasive developmental disorder spectrum. It is not the only symptom. It comes along with many others, but it is interesting why they don't, right? And so, yes. Vygotsky also affected education just like Piaget did, and he also put a lot of emphasis on education. He talked about both peer collaboration and assisted discovery, where the teacher's role is not one of didactic, like let me give you knowledge. In his mind, it was a symbiotic relation between the teacher and the student, and the teacher or the adult guided the child's participation, provided enough scaffolding so that the child could find his way, right? So promoted thinking as much as promoted acquiring new information, right? Applications of this kind of thought, do we see Vygotsky's influence at Bilkent, whether there is any Vygotskian influence at Bilkent's educational policies? What do you think? Something that you guys mostly hate, yes?
Well, we do ask questions to them, and some teachers have summary slides at the end of the chapter. Mm-hmm. And we can ask you questions via email or to
So yes, you can ask questions. What else? Discussion groups, very nice. Homeworks.
Because they're asking questions to us about the subject.
But then how are we going to separate what Vygotsky said from a more didactic teaching? So if it were didactic, I would be the person who keeps asking questions just like I did a second ago. And you would be the people who answer these questions. But we need to go beyond it. In not all of your lessons it might be possible, but in 350 we're going to do it a lot actually. Group projects. Yes. Who likes group projects? One person. Depends on the, and that person, yes, has a disclaimer. Depends on, I agree, it depends on the group. Sometimes it becomes more of a social challenge than actually doing the work. But it is designed, these projects are, so I said Bilkent because, you know, there's a lot of projects to be done, right? By the time you graduate, you have probably at least taken part in 3 or 4 projects with peers small and big. Your senior thesis is a project that you may undertake yourself or commonly, many times, with another student as well. And so these would be Vygotskian kind of educational opportunities. Another one is, yes, teacher-student take turns leading dialogue, asking, summarizing, clarifying, predicting. There are actually now computer programs where this is a very fun computer program. It's actually free online, but it's for English-speaking children for the time being, where what they do is the child teaches an avatar curriculum. So topics in the curriculum. So imagine yourself, when you shift roles, so right now you're a student, but say this was a study session, you and your best friend are studying, your best friend had some difficulty, she was sick, she didn't come to class that day, and you say, okay, I'm going to go over the slides for you. What just happened? You changed your role. You actually are now taking a teaching perspective. And who needs to know this class best? I do, not because my name is teacher, but because I keep trying to teach it. And trying to teach leads me to take your perspective. Not just knowing the information in the book will not help me 100%. I need to be able to anticipate, for example, where you're going to have difficulty, which topics may be a little bit more challenging, how to make them less challenging, and so on and so forth. So I start thinking about examples. I might, for example, in order not to make this a dry topic, think about the discussion between you and me about the Vygotskian practices at Bilkent, right? And doing that also teaches, in turn, me. I learn, every time I teach, I keep relearning stuff. And so that's also a nice Vygotskian teaching, I guess. Cooperative learning, small groups, classmates work toward common goals. Yes, we talked about it. The evaluation of Vygotsky's theory, how Vygotsky was right. It helps explain cultural diversity and cognition. Emphasizes the importance of teaching. Why diversity? We didn't talk about diversity all that much. Why do you think his teachings helped us appreciate cultural diversity more?
Was it pretend play?
Pretend play, I gave a cultural example, but not because of pretend play only. Yes?
Because we focused on social interaction.
Yes. Yes, very nice. Because he focuses on social interaction. He will later also tell us that certain cultures might actually emphasize different ways of learning, different information. So he has a way for explaining cultural differences. That was missing in Piaget, right? For Piaget, all children, whether they are from Nigeria, Turkey, China, Korea, Holland, wherever. I keep saying Holland. Salient information. Mira Hoca would be able to explain it. Yeah, let's say France. And so, yes, so doing this basically gives us an idea of why children might have different ways of thinking, different amounts of information in different cultures. How might he have been wrong? Well, his focus on language de-emphasizes observation and other learning methods. He says little about biological contributions to cognition, and he's vague in explanations of change. We will talk more about him, but Vygotsky died at the age of 36. He didn't have much time, and Piaget died, I think, 86. So there's like half a century of productive work that Piaget did that Vygotsky could not because his life was cut short. And so he doesn't have as much written output as Piaget. His teachings were in the preliminary stage. It is remarkable that he influenced cognitive development research so much with such a limited amount of output. And we will talk more about what he has done in 350. So we are going to go on to chapter 7 now. Efan, yes, of course. So here we are now. This is the second cognitive development chapter, and we are going to take an information processing perspective to cognitive development. Here we are not really going to talk about big names with, I mean, there's going to be some researchers who are big names that we talk about, but we talked about Vygotskian theory, Piagetian theory. Here we're going to think and talk about more cognitive components and how different researchers have conceptualized them. So the information processing approach focuses on attention, memory, and self-management or self-regulation abilities. It basically, in the 60s and 70s, when the first computers started taking off, psychologists were quite enchanted by the idea of a computer. Why? Because it provided a very tangible model for understanding how regular people like you and me think. If we can program a computer to do certain tasks, can we understand how our minds are programmed to do certain tasks, right? Can we understand what components our mind, not brain, our minds have? So brain imaging also later made it explicit how the brain works. But at this stage, when information processing first took off, we're talking 60s, 70s, they weren't really doing a whole ton of scanning studies or anything, but we were thinking about how does the mind work. This was very useful for research because it provided very clear and precise models with this kind of input, that kind of processing, and this kind of output kind of models. It allowed for computer simulations, so we could imagine a model and then program it to see if it works. Do we always get the same output when we put the same input? And it allowed for clear predictions with behavioral data. So it was a wonderful tool for cognitive psychologists. It still is. The impact, and also it allowed us to take into account the impact of task demands. So if you increase the task demands, for example, how would you predict this processor to react? What kind of decrease would you expect in the output? Would it be quality or quantity? So we could basically manipulate these and see examples. And also, by that, it's tried to also focus on some cultural differences. Certain inputs might be more common in certain cultures versus others, and so on and so forth. So there was advantages to this model, and this is how it started. So this is Atkinson and Schifrin's model for memory. And this is from 1968. A lot of changes has been made to this model. I am putting this because it is one of the quintessential, almost symbols of how information processing started conceptualizing the mind. It was a very influential system. It has been studied a lot. Now, it has been revised too, and I'm sure in your cognitive courses you actually see that it has been revised. But just to give a very simple example of what we're talking about when we say information processing, so here you see the stimulus input, for example, and we are trying, say you're trying to memorize your best friend's phone number, right? And then it goes to the sensory register, right? With attention, the help of attention, you can actually put it into short-term memory store. And you can put it into storage if you rehearse it or you use certain memory strategies on it. If it's put into the long term, you can also retrieve it later on too. And there's something called the central executive, which is the conscious part of the mind, according to this model. Again, a lot of changes have been made, but it controls attention, and it selects, applies, and evaluates strategies. So for example, is rehearsal a good strategy to memorize a number for you? Maybe for you it is, maybe for me it isn't. Maybe I need to look at the numbers and come up with either a pattern or a meaningful personal relation to the numbers, right? Maybe it has the numbers of my birth date in it, so it's easier to remember, whatnot. Now, what are the implications of development of memory, say? We see that there are actually developments in the broad areas. But again, the short-term memory store, and now we talk about working memory, for example, not just short-term memory. We talk about executive functioning, and we will talk about it in this chapter too, rather than central executive. But we see basic capacity increases as children get older, so they can store more information, but they also get faster at processing. They need smaller amounts of time to process information, and they can use executive function, attention in meaningful ways to learn the information. So as children grow older, they have a better hold of their executive function abilities, which helps them become more able learners. Let's talk about working memory. Now, both short-term and working memory show improvements from early childhood to early adulthood. And we look at short-term memory usually with something called the digit span, and working memory with a task called the backward digit span. Does anybody know what these two tasks are? These are also in WISC, Welser Intelligence Scale, for adults and for children. What it is in the digit span, you tell the test taker, whether a child or an adult, numbers. And first you tell them two numbers, and you ask the person to repeat them back to you. For example, I say 2, 5. Your job is to say 2, 5. And then after you do it several times, then I go on to 3 digits. And this time I give you a new, every time it's a random set of numbers. It's not the same number getting longer. So this next time I might say 7, 5, 4. And you go 7, 5, 4. And then it goes to 4, 5, 6. And at one point you start failing, obviously. In the backward digit span, your job, it's the same. Actually, you just have to tell me the numbers in reverse order. So if I say 2, 7, you say 7, 2. With very young children, we usually do this task with animal names, so short animal names. For example, you may come with, let's do this in Turkish, at kaz. And the child's job is to say, at kaz, or if it's reverse, kaz at, right? So, I mean, it should be animals that the child knows. You test that before. But if the child is, so if you're trying to do this with a 4-year-old and you think the child doesn't know numbers well enough, so instead of using numbers, you choose animal names. So it makes a lot of sense. But we see that for short-term memory digit span, for example, in 2.5 years, their memory is for 2 items. But then you see rapid increase by 7 years, 4 to 5 items, adolescence 6 to 7 items, and working memory, early childhood 2, early adulthood 4 to 5 items. Early childhood 2, but yes, this is a very difficult task for preschoolers. Like they have a lot of difficulty reversing. But they have problems with, Piaget could have told us too, right? They have problems with reversibility, period. Especially abstract reversibility, because we don't put pictures in front of them, right? We just tell them, and they need to reverse what they have heard. So it's very difficult for them. But this, both short-term but also working memory, I didn't define working memory, and there wasn't a slide for it. What is working memory? Can somebody enlighten us who has taken cognitive psychology? You guys have seen working memory in cognitive, I'm sure. What is working memory? So let's say, okay, let's give an example. Do you guys go out to restaurants and stuff, eat, but then you split the bill?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Everybody pays for what they ate and what they drank. So what happens if it was a long night and if you're a big table, then the bill comes. Yes, the waiter is there with the device, and usually at that point I say, come back in 10 minutes, we are going to do some math. But somebody, so by the time this happens, it has become night, and so you can barely see it. Somebody holds their phone, you're looking at the bill. And so, you know, Berk-Can says, okay, I had 2 beers, a hamburger, and a cheesecake. And so you go, bir is işte şu kadar, the other is. So what does Berkcan have to do? So you keep saying, you know, the beer is this, the cheesecake is this, the hamburger is this. If he only remembered it short term, he would have to just repeat back, hamburger was işte 14 liras, the beer was 11 liras, whatever. But that's not what he's doing. He's adding it in his mind as the new information comes, right? So he says, okay, beer 11 plus hamburger 14 is 25, plus cheesecake, another 15 is 40. I don't know what kind of restaurant this is, but yes. But so he's actually, so what he hears, he's not keeping in short-term memory so that he can just parrot it back later. He's doing an operation on it. He's adding them. And that depends on his working memory.
So what is sensory memory?
Sensory memory is just the auditory signature. So, you know, I say cheesecake 15 liras. It's you remembering me saying cheesecake 15 liras. Remembering my voice. You can repeat melodies in your head, right? It is not yet processed as information. You're relying on your sensory ability to keep repeating it.
So first sensory,
Then it, yes. And so that's what it is. There are individual differences, and the individual differences of working memory predict school achievement. So those children, for example, according to a large-scale study done in the United Kingdom, those children who show problems with working memory, a majority of them also had problems at school. Because working memory is also what you do when you take notes. Some of you I see are taking notes. In note-taking, what you have to do, you're not hopefully writing everything I say the way I say it, right? Because I'm using a communication style that's more conversational. I'm trying to talk to you. But if you write every single word that I say, I mean, you're going to be exhausted by the end of class. It's going to be very tiring. But effective note-taking requires that you use your working memory. You think about the gist of what I just said, and you write it in your own words. That's why there is now new research that shows that note-taking via computer, iPad, is actually not as effective as note-taking by hand, especially if you're good at it. So for example, I become quite fast with like typing. And so when I go to meetings, I can type verbatim most of the time, unless the person is speaking too fast. But what happens is I remember very little afterwards because I have put all of my cognitive energy into hearing and typing without actually processing the information. So if I were to take notes on a notepad with a paper and pencil, I wouldn't be able to catch up by hand. But what I would have to do is store the information temporarily, get the gist out of it, and write that. And so, does it make sense? Note-taking by hand actually was found to be more supportive of learning as compared to computer. But I am not trying to dissuade you from using your iPad. I take notes on iPads when I go to conferences because it's just faster. I haven't yet changed that either. And so, poverty, low SES, is correlated with low working memory capacity. We need more on this. So why might it be that children who are coming from more low SES backgrounds? Also, one last thing that your book mentions is also stress. Children who are coming from low SES backgrounds also show higher levels of cortisol throughout their childhood, which also hampers with brain development as well. Not that brain development doesn't happen, but it doesn't reach the kind of optimum capacity that it could. And so that might be. And when we say low SES, I really want to emphasize this. We don't mean poor just. You know, there are many families in Turkey too who are earning less than desired. But this is different than the low SES that in North America. In North America, low SES is a multitude of risk factors. it might be, look, it is quite possible the child is coming from a single parent family. It is quite possible the child might have a teenage mother, a very young mother. It is quite possible that the father might be incarcerated, might be in jail. It is very possible, again, that the family speaks a different language than is spoken outside the home. We're talking about the United States, low SES. It is, again, very possible that both parents or the single parent is doing menial jobs and is working more than one job. It is very possible that the children are left at home then to cater for themselves. So all of these, it's again very possible that they're living in very dangerous neighborhoods. All of this comes in this cloud of low SES. So when you see studies done in the United States that says low SES do this, middle class do that, I don't think it is possible to take those studies and apply the findings verbatim to, say, Turkish culture. Because low SES in Turkey can mean all of the things that I said, but low SES is not characterized by all of these things in Turkey. So when I say low SES in Turkey, what you think about is not really single parents, incarcerated fathers, you know, this isn't, or children speaking a different language. So we need to take these with a grain of salt and realize that some of these results might have differences also. So this was a cautionary note. Okay, I forgot my watch, so. Okay, we also observe developments in speed of processing, how fast children can process. Kyle's extensive research shows decreases in processing speed from 7 to 22 years of age. There's a sharp decline around 12 years. I don't have the graph. And there could be cross-cultural differences. But don't think that just because the speed of processing has slowed down, the person has somehow become dumber. Because while this is slowing down, the child is also learning metacognitive abilities, attention regulation abilities that actually make most use of this decreased capacity. So it's not, I'm not saying that by 22 years of age, we have become somehow less intelligent. That's not what I'm saying at all. Developments in executive functions. Okay, so executive functions, we are going to spend about 30 minutes next semester discussing what executive functions are. That is because there isn't 100% consensus in the field as to what they are. You might wonder, how is this possible? Because we all know that it's about attention, and it includes some memory components too. But it's also about regulation. It's also about metacognitive abilities. So how big the definition is, or how small the definition is, how inclusive or exclusive it is, differs from one researcher to the next. We will talk about this. But for now, what you can know is that it is a set of cognitive operations and strategies necessary for self-initiated purposeful behavior in relatively novel, challenging situations. This is exact quote from your book. And it's relatively novel, challenging situations. It also means that it is not your attention when you are watching Survivor on TV, right? That isn't really requiring a lot of executive functions from you, okay? So it includes controlling attention, suppressing impulses to do something else, for example, coordinating information working memory, planning, organizing, monitoring, flexibly redirecting thought and behavior, changing what you're doing according to the feedback you are getting. So this shows significant development throughout early and middle childhood. There's a component of heritability, but also a component of the environment. And so, for example, we know ADHD is one problem in which, one childhood problem, and also it can happen in adulthood too, where the individuals diagnosed with ADHD actually have problems with executive functions because they can't either maintain their attention, they can't monitor their attention, they can't use different strategies flexibly. So that's what it is. And so
Science tells us that brains, minds, are built, not born. And at the center of this dynamic architecture are a set of skills called executive function and self-regulation.
Children's self-regulation and executive function are key ingredients in their lifetime performance. It's not just about learning language or learning numbers or learning colors.
We have to be able to work effectively with others, with distractions, with multiple demands. These actually are skills that contribute to the productivity of the American workforce.
Look at your shapes. What should you have done next?
Educators, I think, are looking for just this sort of thing. And when we describe what we mean by executive function, they say, yes, that's it. That's exactly, the problem. These kids, they can tell me these rules, but they can't actually use them.
What's this?
A toolbox.
A toolbox.
What is executive function?
Safety goggles.
Safety goggles.
Probably the best way to think about it is sort of like an air traffic control system in the brain. Just like an air traffic control system has to manage lots of airplanes going on lots of runways and really exquisite timing and so on. A child has to manage a lot of information and avoid distractions. We really think of it as involving working memory and inhibitory control and mental flexibility. Take a situation where a child is having to take turns. So first of all, the child has to have inhibitory control. The child has to be able to stop whatever he or she is doing and let the other child take a turn.
Cute.
But when it's your turn again, you also have to remember what it is you're supposed to be doing. So that pulls on working memory. If the children who are taking the turns after you do something unpredictable, you have to be able to adjust what you're going to do next. And that requires mental flexibility. Children who are struggling with these capacities often look like children who just aren't paying attention, or children who are deliberately not controlling themselves.
If you don't have self-regulation, you act out and the teacher puts you in timeout, and so then you miss part of the learning that's going on, and then you are more upset because you're behind, and so you act out, and so you get this downward spiral.
How does executive function develop?
7, and +4.
In little children, and even in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match prime.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult-type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become, because you're hoping to strengthen those neural connections.
You're at 24.
Slowly but surely, you're going to be able to step back, and that child's going to go into the world with these skills where they can get along with other people, change rules, and they can be flexible, and they can accomplish new things, and they're unafraid.
I got bit by my dog in my arm. Oh dear.
If we don't learn these skills, during the childhood and adolescent years when they're coming online, we are really ill-equipped as an adult to hold a job, to maintain a marriage, to raise children, to get along with each other, to basically be part of a civil society.
You're okay.
So I will argue next class that executive functions is one of those things that parents actually have huge influence over during early childhood, that it actually is a great resource for children to succeed in formal education. But I'll leave that to next lecture. See you on Wednesday.